After Clara finished her breakfast, the four noble women moved under the main pavilion, where Liluvian's findings had been collected overnight. As they pored over the information, Liluvian would periodically appear to add another folder to the table. At this point, the initial reports of the town had been fully completed and the shadow demons were now being sent to inspect the baronial manors, followed by the multitude of villages and hamlets laid throughout the county. Ludmilla was uncertain how long the rural investigation would take. The duchy's primary industries revolved around agriculture and forestry, with the capital also being a major hub of trade. Though its industries seemed meager compared to other inland territories, Facet County still followed these same basic principles. As cities serviced duchies, towns serviced counties. Regardless of where one went in Riestais, roughly 1 in 20 lived in urban centers, meaning that Facet Town, with its population of 2,000, serviced a county population of 40,000. It was unknown how many of those people had escaped to Riestais as a result of the annexation by the Sorceress Kingdom, but, even if half had fled over the border, as the gathered claims seemed to imply, they were still looking at a population of 20,000 to survey. Realistically speaking, they could only rely on the information gained from manors and the homes of local administrators stationed throughout the territory. There was not enough time for a thorough sweep. What they had collected, unfortunately, confirmed their feelings from the previous day. Worse yet, it was only what had been allowed to bubble to the surface of the mire they were now sorting through. There was a sniff across the table from her, and Ludmilla looked up when a folder landed on the table and slid halfway across its surface. Florian was seated in her chair, hands covering her face. "How could they do any of this?" she said between sobs. "Do they feel any guilt at all? This is all just selfish and cruel." Leanne frowned down at the folder and reached out to pick it up, leafing through the contents. "Looks about the same as the one I'm working on," she said. "Gotta say, I set the bar low going into this, but this is stupid beyond belief. It's like eating your own leg because you're hungry. They put so much effort into managing this mess that they could just do something normal instead and do far better." Ludmilla looked down at her own documents. They had divided the work between themselves. Facet County contained 6 baronies, so they had each assigned themselves to one for the time being. The town was an ongoing investigation, and the remainder would be left until the end. What she saw already, however, was enough to make her wish she hadn't eaten such a large breakfast. Though much of what she read outlined strictly illegal activities, even legal ones were handled in such an absurd way that they may as well have been crimes. Slavery, narcotics, all manner of extortion and protection rackets that utilized local mercenary groups. Taxes and rent were so absurd and arbitrary that the tenants turned to crime to survive. Even the laws themselves were twisted in every way possible to the advantage of the local authorities. House Facet had even turned the collection of fines, penalties and contraband from illegal activities into an industry of its own. Rather than being severe enough to deter criminals, they were lenient to the extent that it just became another sort of tax. Reading through the reports was like being presented with a dark reflection of what should be. A significant portion of the county's economy was being fed by illegitimate industries and, as Ludmilla sought to develop advanced industries in Warden's Vale by establishing a framework of basic industries, House Facet had created advanced industries out of a framework of basic illegal ones. Ludmilla looked across the table again. "Leanne," she said, "it's clear what's happening here, but how does one even begin to tread this path? Adopting these practices that inevitably become this spiral of decay." "Could be any number of reasons," Leanne replied. "The vast majority of these records only go back a few seasons. They probably just burn what they don't need anymore since it's an unneeded risk to keep around. It's usually not as simple as waking up one day and deciding it's a good idea to ruin your own fief." Leanne looked to the center of the table, where a map of the county was laid out. She took a sip from her glass and continued frowning down at it. After a few minutes, she set down her drink and pointed to the map. "This duchy has been the domain of House Vaself ever since Riestais has been Riestais," she said. "The nobles along the highways are either cadet branches from the interior or merchant stock like the 3 of us here. If I were to make up a believable story about how things happened, I would say that Facet is a cadet branch that came to claim the lands here rather than a merchant house." Leanne's finger traced over the features of the map beyond the highway, where the primeval forests over the rugged hills met the developed lands along the roads. You can see here the extent of where they've grown in the past, so at some point they did make earnest efforts to cultivate their lands. I would guess that they underestimated how hard it is to tame this sort of terrain. Most of Riestice's heartlands are fertile plains and forested parklands. What was invested into them wasn't enough, and they couldn't find anyone that thought it was worth the cost, so they turned to illegal activities for the revenues to finance development. Could have been some outsider making some attractive offer, or they could have done it themselves. So they did this for the short-term gains, Ludmilla said, in order to continue what they started. Why didn't they stop when they had what they needed? Because you can't just stop, Leanne replied, and with one thing comes others. Illegal practices and contraband goods are outlawed precisely because the authorities decide that they are harmful and unproductive in the long term. You're always sacrificing something when doing it, and it's only profitable when someone else is doing the sacrificing for you. You're also opening avenues for illegal activity from elsewhere to seep in simply by doing business with them. Those types don't just go away when asked. Enforcing justice is a noble's duty, Ludmilla frowned. Nothing stops the Lord from doing so. Ah, well, I guess that'd be easy for a frontier noble to say, Leanne replied, but most nobles don't come from militant traditions like you have. Once a group like that becomes entrenched, militia just won't cut it. Just like people can become strong by adventuring or protecting the borders, these criminal groups have those that become ridiculously strong by doing what they do. Imagine a couple of Mithril or even Orichalcum-ranked adventurers becoming criminals in someone's territory. You'll lose hundreds of men just trying to oust them. They can just keep you quiet with threats and, if you still don't behave, they'll just kill you and your heirs until they find one that will. Which brings me to another point. You don't even have to allow crime to flourish in your territory. If some powerful syndicate decides that your place is ideal to set up shop, they'll just do it with or without your permission. The vast majority of nobles can't do anything about that, no matter how upright they are. It's something that requires adamantite rank adventurers to deal with, or someone with equivalent power. These groups will focus on a few fiefs at a time, until they've become too weak to offer any further resistance, before moving on to new ones. That way, a whole bunch of nobles don't just pool their resources to hire someone strong enough to exterminate them. So you're saying that this might not even be their fault? Ludmilla asked. Well, it's just a story formed out of what I know about this sort of thing happening elsewhere, Leanne answered. We'd have to dig really deep to find out how it actually started, but we don't have to dig much to see if they're being forced into unlawful activities. Considering what we've seen so far, though, I wouldn't bet on it. Florine returned to stand beside Leanne, and Ludmilla looked around the table. Anyone else have any idea about this? She sighed. Not that it matters if everyone in this ridiculous place is willingly doing it, I suppose. I don't know how it started, Clara replied, nor did I hear anything about it from my father, but I can see how it can easily stay this way. I can especially see this looming crisis that they have over their heads due to their domain incomes being substantially subsidized by this illicit activity. Clara pulled several partially filled parchments from around the table together in front of her. From what I've put together so far, out of the efforts that the Lionham sisters have coordinated, it could be said that Facet County has 4 primary sources of income. Believe it or not, the majority is from legitimate exports. Due to its proximity to the duchy border, however, most of their trade flowed west towards the larger markets of Riestice's heartlands rather than east towards Eranthal, where they would need to compete directly with the much closer local territories over a smaller market. The county industries do not produce anything that is worth trading over vast distances, so there is no profit in directing their goods to the east beyond the regional markets. Clara picked up one of the sheets and held it up between her fingers. It was a compiled record of House Facet's incomes after Eranthal's annexation by the Sorceress Kingdom. Regular trade with Riestice has been reduced to less than a trickle, but the new development in Eranthal and the territories hungry for timber, charcoal and stone have compensated for this shortfall. To anyone outside of this county, it has the effect of making House Facet appear to be just another normal territory, one of many contributing to the growth of the capital. This demand for materials will only last as long as the building continues. However, she set the parchment back down. Once things settle into a more normal pace, Facet County's exports will shrivel up into a fraction of what it was before the annexation. Meaning that they will lean harder into everything else they have been doing, Leanne concluded. What else do they have? Florian asked. It can't be that they've been doomed one way or the other due to the annexation. Trade is the second part of Facet County's legitimate incomes, but without Riesties, this territory goes from straddling a major artery of trade to effectively being the end of the road, the furthest point from our trading partners to the east through the Empire. Another of House Facet's major incomes have always involved servicing trade, so one could say that yes, the annexation could be considered the main factor. I will be perfectly honest and say the direct cause of their economic woes has little to do with their criminal connections and everything to do with the drastic shift in trade flows. What the illicit activity has done is hamstring their development over generations. If House Facet had properly developed their holdings rather than bleed their population dry with these other exploitative and short-sighted practices, they should have been robust enough to cushion the blow. All of the Western territories are in the same situation, but all aside from Facet County have been able to weather the changes so far. So this leaves House Facet with a major crisis, Leanne concluded, and they are trying to finance their succession dispute with the short-term incomes from recent exports rather than set their differences aside to ensure there is even a domain left standing after the dust has settled. Like I said, stupid beyond belief. They would rather rule over rubble than cooperate and turn their lands around. It's ironic, Clara said. Count Vulcanheim's offer is actually the true solution, allowing them the time to adopt our new systems and break out of the ever-shrinking cage that they've fashioned for themselves. We can't even offer it to them because it's clear that they also need to answer for their crimes, which they will never admit knowledge of. The sanctions that the House of Lords are resorting to in order to force them back into line would only severely damage House Facet if they were actually practicing legitimate business, while other nations are perfectly willing to take what is basically left of what they have to offer. That was the main problem with Princess Rena's legislation against slavery, Leanne sighed. I suppose the problem wouldn't just go away being in the Sorceress Kingdom. There was a problem with the outlawing of slavery? Ludmilla asked. Yes, Leanne said, a huge problem. As far as her ideas went, it was probably one of her worst, yet somehow it was the biggest one that was passed into law. At face value it may have won her the favor of the people and a handful of empty-headed lords, but in reality it was extraordinarily narrow-minded. You support slavery? Clara asked with a worried look. I abhor it, Leanne replied, but my personal feelings mean little in the grand scheme of things. The fact of the matter is that slavery is legal nearly everywhere else, and Riesties never had the means to enforce this law in the first place. The only effect it really had was to drive up the price of slaves abroad and make exporting them out of Riesties far more profitable. Those that keep slaves in the country still have them under various guises, so in reality not much changes beyond giving criminal organizations an effective monopoly on slave exports. They were already experts at evading and circumventing the law, so it's like they're being rewarded for their investments in those areas. The low cost of undead labor would make exporting slaves instead of transitioning them to advanced industries an attractive prospect to any unscrupulous lord seeking short-term profits like this. Clara frowned after she finished speaking, as if belatedly realizing what she had come up with. After watching those shadow demons cover so much ground this morning, Leanne said, I have a fair idea of how quickly they can investigate things. If they're being effectively coordinated by authorities upholding proper justice, then anyone that runs afoul of the Sorceress Kingdom's laws will find themselves facing an undead enforcer. Leanne looked down at the map with a conflicted expression on her face. I'm still having trouble accepting this, she said. Accepting what? Ludmilla looked up from the documents on the table. Leanne's gaze met her own, but her icy stare wavered. She looked back down at the table and took a deep breath. This authority you have been granted sidesteps traditional due process and a lord's right to exercise justice in their own domain, she said. I can't deny how expedient it is given the right circumstances, but, at the same time, it's not power that a regular person should wield. You seem to be every bit as austere as what I've seen of you so far suggests, but what about others? Surely you won't be the only one of these, agents? Auditors? Harriers? If we accomplish what we've set out to achieve here, the royal court may decide to employ additional agents to deal with the workings of the nation that His Majesty's servants are unable to. From what I've seen of her, Lady Shiltir is a noble of the highest caliber, Clara said. I may sound like a bard when saying so, but some may consider her a noble of legendary acclaim. Perhaps she sensed that Ludmilla was suited for this duty before bestowing it upon her. An uncertain silence fell over the table. Tales of legendary heroes were plentiful. Their spectacular feats of might and magic were the staple of many a tale spun by poets and minstrels, enjoyed by all walks of life. The continued presence of such individuals in the present solidified the notions surrounding their existence. Nobles, on the other hand, occupied a more mundane place in folklore. Depending on the audience, they could be the subject of a romantic story, little more than a name that sent heroes on daring quests, or abhorrent villains that opposed a righteous cause. Indeed, in many a common tale, nobles were more likely to be objects of derision and scorn, to be vilified rather than any sort of realistic portrayal of reality. In the legends of old, important noble figures existed as well, but attributing the idea of them as heroes generally only happened if their feats were recognizable to the general audience. The runesmith king of the 13 heroes was of these rare examples, but what was sung of him had nothing to do with his qualities as a leader or administrator. The stories of nobles generally boiled down into a handful of points which did not speak much of how they were accomplished. As often as a meager administrator was lauded as a genius for reigning in a time of peace and prosperity, adept administrators that ensured the survival of their people through great adversity could be derided as a fool for achieving little by the same measure. Only the end results tended to be remembered in the songs and annals of history. For all that they did, it seemed only nobles and scholars could discern the quality of those that came before them. Faithful portrayals of history were for the history books and not for entertainment, and even those did not record the minutiae that revolved around their administrative office. Only by laying out the events and circumstances that accompanied the results of each figure's rule could one even begin to draw rough conclusions on whether they were to be acclaimed or derided. The one man they knew of in their time that might actually qualify as such, Emperor Jerkniv Runefalord Elnix, would undoubtedly only be commonly remembered centuries from now by his grim epitaph, and as the man who subjected his own empire to a foreign power shortly after consolidating his own rule. Perhaps, if the Sorceress Kingdom had never risen to power, Emperor Jerkniv would have carved his name out in the annals of history and built a legend of his own. As things stood, however, even as his contemporaries, they knew very little of what he was truly capable of, only a handful of the outcomes resulting from his reign. This discussion is a bit preemptive, Ludmilla said. Leanne has perfectly valid concerns, but at the same time it's not an appointment we have any influence over. This is an official duty, so those burdened with it should act accordingly. In the end, the royal court will evaluate the results and whether it is an office to be expanded upon. I would hardly think that there would be absolutely no oversight, given the orderly nature of the Sorceress Kingdom. She's right, Leanne, Florine said from beside her. We're already up to annexing work here, but you keep finding more things to worry about that we have no control over. That's always been a bad habit of yours. Yes, let's focus on what we have in front of us now, Clara agreed. I, for one, still cannot even begin to imagine how to break this standoff between the facets in any way aside from force. Then perhaps we should just use force, Ludmilla said. If exercised correctly, the right set of actions could dislodge them from their stubborn positions more than any amount of reasoning. An uneasy silence settled over the pavilion at her words. Ludmilla cleared her throat and attempted to explain her rationale. There must be some basis for this bravado of theirs, she said. Something that gives them their confidence, that provides them with the feeling that they are untouchable. Wouldn't that be the law itself? Florine said. This has been the state of affairs for generations. They are nobles, and the law is in their hands to exercise as they see fit. Other laws prevent other nobles from interfering, so that should be the basis of this belief in their own infallibility, yes? I do not think for one moment that those who would so readily twist the letter of law so far that it bends in on itself would put their faith in the law as an absolute defense, Ludmilla said. It cannot simply be bravado, can it? There must be some fallback that they would rely on in the event that someone does not care for their behavior or the law. If you seek a way to undermine their confidence, Clara said, then what about weakening their ability to pursue this succession dispute? If they are driven to desperation, they will almost certainly turn to whatever other cards they have left to play. Just keep in mind that we can't have a repeat of last year's attempt at removing a giant nest of hornets with a fire arrow. Leanne and Florine looked up from their work to stare at Ludmilla curiously. That attempt was decisively successful, Ludmilla stated. You decisively burned down an entire copse of trees as well, Clara shot back. You won't be able to replace the town like you did the lost timber. It's not as if the whole town will burn to the ground if I... Ludmilla left her words hanging, and Leanne and Florine's faces turned ashen. Several figures entered the pavilion. My ladies, Willuvian lowered her head respectfully. I have brought Liam with me. Say has come as well. Liam opened his eyes to a dreamlike world. Staring up through streams of sunlight filtering through curtains of intricate lace, his gaze ran over the pastel patterns on the polished ceiling above. The fabric of his covers slid across his skin with a sensation he had never felt before as he shifted slightly to look around. Soft sounds of breathing turned his head, and he discovered his sister sleeping soundly beside him. They were, inside? The richly decorated surroundings and expensive-looking fabrics laid about him were a stark contrast to the muddy alley he last remembered seeing. No, something else had happened. There was a demon, and a slow journey through the darkness, a memory veiled by a haze of fatigue and agony. The recollection most clear to him was the struggle in the alley, the pain in his side and how it slowly became harder and harder to breathe. He was dead, then. The past few months had been one long struggle to survive. He had never considered what would come after. He never wasted his time listening to the priests, but he imagined the torturous journey through the darkness must have been to reach the other side of whatever lay between life and death. Liam lifted the covers to check his side and found only unmarred skin where there was almost certainly a terrible injury before. Say stirred at the disturbance and her heavy lashes fluttered open. Why was his sister here anyways? The question made his heart sink. If he was dead, then she must have died as well. Liam? Her voice murmured drowsily. Say uncurled and stretched herself, then stopped abruptly. She sat up and turned towards him, hands hovering worriedly in his direction. He had seen this somewhere before. Are you okay? Does it hurt anywhere? Are you hungry? I'll ask for some food. The mention of food in the flood of questions made his stomach growl. Did dead people get hungry? Maybe he became a zombie. Say, he said after an alarming detail caught his attention. Wait. Who are you asking for food? Where are we? This is a noble's carriage, I think, his sister replied. They said they would have food for you when you woke up. A noble? Freely offered food? Those men, there was blood. How am I better again? They said that you were hurt bad, Say said, so they used a healing potion. Liam felt panic rising in his chest. It was definitely a trap. Healing potions were very expensive, at least 5 gold for even the cheapest ones, or was it more now? Unless. He checked his side again, pressing around his ribs to see if anything felt wrong. It wasn't a cheap illusion, and he hadn't been given something to numb the pain. Neither did he think his injury was so light that a herbal remedy was able to work on him. Those took much longer to act. A real potion had been used on him, the kind that adventurers used. Looking at his sister's worried expression, his mind worked to find a way out of their situation, but he could think of nothing. Adults played dirty, and nobles were the dirtiest of them all. They had rules for everyone, and decided who the rules counted for. He had seen many seedy people work on their behalf, and many helplessly fall to their tricks. If they couldn't get what they wanted from an unknowing victim, then they used force. If force was not an option, then they used greed. If greed did not work, Say wasn't stupid or greedy. They must have used his injury against her, to force her to go along quietly. Now that they had tended to him, they would demand repayment. Liam could no more come up with 5 gold coins than he could have won against a dozen of those big men in the alley. There was food as well. Maybe Say had simply given up and decided to take it along with the poison that was the debt that would now be claimed against them. Despite his worry, his stomach rumbled again at the passing thought of a meal. Say crawled over to the door, stopping to straighten her clothing, clean, fine clothing far removed from the barely serviceable rags of the night before. I'm going to go ask, she said as she pulled the polished latch of the door. They left clothes here for you as well. Say stepped out and shut the door behind her. Clothes. The troubles in his mind mounted as he reached out for the neatly folded articles nearby. The size of their debt continued to grow as he unfolded a fresh white linen shirt. Sturdy brown broadcloth pants along with a tooled leather belt lay beneath it. There were woolen stockings as well. Liam wanted to run away, but nobles had men and horses and hounds. He recalled the piercing gaze of the noble attendant that had instantly detected him even when he hid in the dark the night. There was no way they could escape from such terrifying people. He pulled the shirt down over his head and the door opened again. Say had reappeared with a uniformed woman at her back. His sister crawled back in and received a shiny covered tray from the woman, who then withdrew quietly and closed the door lightly behind her. Say placed the tray in front of him and lifted the cover. He swallowed as the aroma of the meal drifted up to wash over him. Fresh bread and crisp bacon. Sliced fruits and vegetables. A bowl of clear soup. He lifted a gleaming fork before his unbelieving eyes. It was silver. The tray and its cover were as well. Just how much wealth was placed in front of him? Though he marveled over it all, it confirmed his sister's words. These people must be nobles, who else could be so rich? Liam frowned as he absently picked up a roll, not just a piece, but a whole roll, of bread and split it in half. Its buttery scent filled his nose as the fluffy white inside seemed to spring out to entice him to partake of his meal. He held out one half of the roll to Say, but, to his surprise, she shook her head. I already had mine. She did not meet his eyes. They said there would be some for you too. Liam lowered his hand. I'm not mad, he said. He nibbled on the bread, torn between eating the food and trying to avoid even more trouble, but his hunger inevitably won out. Who are they? Liam asked after finishing the first full meal he had eaten since the autumn festival. I don't know, Say said. They have a lot of servants, armed men and maids. They aren't from here. Liam recalled the nobles that had visited with Countess Fassett. These must be them, then. He did not know much about nobles from the east, only that they were far more wealthy and powerful than the ones here, meaning they were far more dangerous. The monster that had killed those men in the alley was proof of this. They had fallen into the clutches of some bad people. His troubled thoughts followed him as they left the carriage. Liam laced the boots that were awaiting him outside on the steps. The soles did not fit him, but it was far better than walking around barefoot. Though the hazy trek through the night felt like it had stretched on forever, he was still surprised to find them so far from the town. Stepping out onto the grass, he turned to look at the ornate carriage that he had awoken in. There were a row of them, the same ones he had seen the previous evening. One had the two sigils on placards fixed to the side. A half-dozen of the same sort of uniformed women went back and forth, carrying laundry and dishes and working in various parts of the camp. The realization that it was a camp Liam understood as odd in itself. A few armed men stood as sentries along the perimeter, while others slowly patrolled back and forth over the area. There were any number of fine inns that they could have stayed at in the town. Why would they choose to stay outside? You're up and about, then, a voice came from behind him, and he jumped. He spun and backed away in a panic. A pretty elf with shoulder-length green hair smiled down at him, covering her mouth with one hand. Her grey eyes sparkled in amusement at his reaction. Good morning, Liam, she said. How are you feeling? He looked up at her, his mouth working soundlessly. The elf's smile did not fade. I'm Willuvian, she pressed her hand to her breast. Your sister shared with us what happened last night. That was very brave of you. The warmth in her voice made him raise his guard even further. Looking over her attire, Liam saw the same black and white uniform fitting neatly over the elf's slender figure. These women were probably maids. The man from the previous evening had been right about his assumption that there were no noble elves. What do you want? He asked carefully. Well, her smile did not fade. If you are well enough, Camilla will see you now. Camilla will see you now. The cold voice echoed from his memory, sending a shudder up his spine. Looking around, he found Say standing nearby and took her hand in his. The elf maid's gaze passed over them and her smile turned up even further as she led them through the camp. She smiled far too much. Adults only smiled when they wanted something from you, or after they hit you. One side of the area was lined with wooden barricades with rows of sharpened wooden stakes. The carriages formed a semicircle around another semicircle of large tents, and within was a grey pavilion. The ridge the camp had been set upon offered a wide view of the surroundings, looking out over the town further up the highway. If it wasn't for the maids working here and there, he would have believed it a camp of mercenaries. Willuvian led them straight to the pavilion, stopping at the edge near a sentry standing watch over the cliffside. My ladies, she said respectfully, I have brought Liam with me. Say has come as well. From inside, 6 women looked towards them. 4 were standing around a wooden table while the other 2 appeared to be maids waiting on them. Of the 4, 3 were dressed in fine clothing, while the last was dressed in a clean, but plain, dress. All of the women inside were young and pretty in their own way. Liam looked back and forth between them wordlessly before he felt a finger jab his side. He started, then interrupted himself to bow awkwardly. Was this how it was done? He wasn't sure what to do after that, so he stayed bent at the waist. Is he okay? One of the women's voices came from the table. Liam tried to recall the voices from the previous evening. He was just a moment ago, my lady, Willuvian said. Bring him forward, then, a different woman said. I'd like to see as much ground covered as possible today. Liam felt a tug on his hand as Say pulled on him. He straightened himself and, as he came close, he realized they were indeed the same noble women that he had seen speaking to Countess Facet the previous evening. He raised his head and saw that the plainly dressed woman was the same one that had seen him spying on the Facet estate, Camilla. She was not wearing the same sort of fancy dress as the others, so was she not a noble? Rather than one of them, she gave off the feeling of being much stronger than the others, stronger than even the rough men in the town that had put him down so easily. Maybe she was a bodyguard, which would explain much. Overhead, a magical lamp cast its light brightly enough to banish the shadows even in the corners of the pavilion. Spread in front of him on the smooth, polished tabletop was a map. Several stacks of paper were arranged around it. A few thick books were sitting over a corner of the map as well. Do you know what this is? The plainly dressed woman asked, seeing his eyes on the table between them. Liam shook his head. It was a map, he knew, but of what he could not tell. A woman in a blue dress, who was nearly as tall as the plainly dressed one beside her, pointed a polished nail to the shapes on the map. This is Facet Town, she said, and then her finger traced a thick line that ran through it. This is the Royal Highway. These other locations along the way are the villages and hamlets leading towards Irantal. Her hand made a broad motion over the surface of the table, the golden waves of her hair spilling over her shoulders as she leaned forward to do so. This is a map of Facet County, your home. A finger jabbed his side again, and Liam peered down at the details on the map. Across the table, a skinny noble woman with blue eyes like Say's, she looked to be closer to his own age, gave him a measuring look. I don't think he can read, she said. Liam felt his face heat up at her statement. She was right, he had no idea what anything on the map said, he couldn't even read the littlest bit. He could only guess what the shapes and lines meant. They had instantly seen through his attempt to look useful. Willuvian can work with him, it did not seem to matter to Camilla. Work? Liam started. The women turned their attention to him. To pay for everything. I can work. Liam's voice trailed off. Work on what? He wasn't sure what they wanted, exactly. The women exchanged glances with one another before Camilla spoke once again. Her sharp, brown-eyed gaze held his own as she spoke. Do you understand the meaning of this work? She asked him. Liam felt his back straighten as a chill ran through his body. She spoke in a way unlike anyone he had heard before, certainly nothing like how one would speak down to children. It was not patronizing or coddling, nor cajoling or sickly sweet with the air of false friendliness seeking to disarm him of his wariness. Her words were expressed in a mellow tone, yet at the same time her voice was like a blade, not one that was pointed at him, but one that directed him with expectation. Authority that stirred him to action. He looked back down at the brightly lit table, at the map, the papers and the books. Swallowing, looked back up at Camilla. You want to know about the town, he said. Things that you can use for what you are doing here. Camilla's gaze held his firmly, her lips pressing into a thin line. Willuvian, she looked to the elf maid. Yes, my lady. Let Luluvian know that Liam and Say will be joining you in your efforts. The maid bowed in affirmation, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. Before they were led away, the woman spoke once more. You may call me Camilla, she said, looking at each of them in turn. Liam, Say, you are under our protection now. I'd have never thought to use that on a child, Clara said after Liam and Say were led out of sight. I wanted to make sure that he knew what he was getting into, Ludmilla replied. A part of me was hoping that he didn't. I cannot rightly consider him a child any longer. He's well aware of what he's doing. Leanne and Florine followed their exchange with blank expressions.
What did she use again?
Leanne said.
Clara looked to Ludmilla, and she nodded in return.
An ability, Clara explained.
The voice of authority.
Well, that's what we've ended up calling it. You've probably heard of it before in one form or another. Maybe you've experienced it directly from members of your family?
Leanne furrowed her brow in befuddlement and Florine mouthed the words several times.
That's just a bard's embellishment,
isn't it?
Leanne said after a moment, something for overblown stories and stupid daydreams. At the most it's when our parents yell really loud and people shut up to listen. She laughed nervously at her own words, but the laughter died away when Ludmilla and Clara shook their heads.
It's a real thing, Clara replied.
I can do it as well. We don't know what exactly is required, but once you understand what it is and how to use it, it's not very hard at all.
Does that mean Florine and I will be able to do it too? Leanne asked.
Probably, Ludmilla answered.
At least, at some point you should be able to.
It took an afternoon to help Clara figure it out, though, and she thought I had gone crazy half the time. When we're not so busy, I'm sure we can teach the both of you as well. What's more important to realize is that the undead labor and powerful armies are not the only thing that has come with the Sorcerer's Kingdom.
I never said I thought you were crazy.
Clara frowned. Ludmilla replied in a flat voice.
What do you mean by that?
Florine said. What's come with the Sorcerer's Kingdom?
I mean, not the going crazy thing.
What will have the greatest impact on our lives is knowledge and the perspective it brings, Ludmilla replied. The Sorcerer's Kingdom brings with it both a mountain of knowledge and the perspective granted by such a vantage. Even at a fundamental level, His Majesty and his servants see many things in a way that is entirely foreign to how we view the world around us. If you've started working with the administrative liches, you might have already noticed hints of that. Their ways will slowly change our own and, as we become more like them, we will become just as foreign to the rest of the world as His Majesty's servants currently are to us.
Ludmilla is descended from adventurers, Clara said, so when she started talking more like one, I didn't think much of it.
But after the time that we spent together figuring out this ability, I realized that she is starting to use terms and concepts that were entirely unknown to me as well. I had to stop her several times to explain what they meant.
This change, is it a good thing, or a bad thing?
Florine asked worriedly. What results from this change is understanding, Ludmilla said, which is neither a good or bad thing in itself. When Clara says that I speak more like an adventurer, she does not mean that my manner of speech has become more coarse. Even before our time, adventurers have measured the world in a different manner, in terms of abilities and tiers, special vocations, ranks and ratings. Lady Shaltier structures her perception along many similar lines, but the heights of her understanding extend far beyond that of adventurers. His Majesty and his servants tower so high above us that I cannot imagine that we would ever reach those same heights of power, but this does not stop us from obtaining useful knowledge and finding ways to apply it to our own lives.
Surely they wouldn't freely distribute too much of this knowledge, Leanne said. As you say, understanding is neither a good or a bad thing, but it can certainly lead to unwelcome outcomes. Untempered knowledge is entirely out of the question, given that they understand what it would entail.
I cannot guess where they would draw that particular line, Ludmilla replied, but what they already offer is enough to change, well, everything. The unthinkable has become common, and a new world of possibilities is now within reach. The three of you should understand all of its far-reaching implications in a greater scope than I am capable of. When Clara spoke to Jacqueline Fassett, she mentioned the prosperity that the future holds. She was not merely referring to cheap labor and easy lives. The citizens of the Sorceress Kingdom stand at the forefront of changes that will overshadow the world, and House Fassett is too wrapped up in their petty squabble to see that they are in the process of denying this future to their people. Realizing this future is a part of our duty, now, Clara said. Everyone here has seen the administrative materials and resources. They present various concepts to us, but the prescribed applications are nowhere near perfect. We are not one-sidedly receiving everything we need. It requires many people to turn such things into reality. As nobles, we are responsible for leading our people through these times of change. Clara turned her attention back to the folders of documents on the table, leaving Leanne and Florine to digest what had been said. The others followed suit. Early in the afternoon, Willuvian appeared with a new folder as they were being served lunch. "How is Liam faring?" Ludmilla asked as Willuvian placed the folder beside the others on the table. "He shows no ill effects from his injuries," her maid replied, "and is fitting in quite well, though I suppose it shouldn't be a surprise. Children in his circumstances inevitably learn that information has value, and in understanding that value he is able to assist in our efforts here quite handily." Willuvian's expression did not match her words. Rather than seeming appreciative of his contributions, her lips turned in a small frown. "Is something the matter?" Ludmilla could not help but match her expression. "He does not trust you, my lady," Willuvian said sourly. "Even from what little I've reviewed here so far," Ludmilla said, "trust would not come easily to anyone in this place." "You saved his life," Willuvian protested. "You gave him a place to rest, clothing to wear, food to eat. My lady has even pledged her protection over his family, but in return he holds only doubt and suspicion." "Suspicion? How do you mean?" "He believes that everything is a ploy," her maid replied. "That your benevolence is merely a debt incurred to chain him to your whims. If it bothers him, that means he also won't suddenly disappear on us, doesn't it?" "As one who has received my lady's grace," Willuvian fumed, "I cannot suffer to see such ingratitude. My sister is going to hurl him off that cliff if she wakes up to witness this behavior." Ludmilla glanced past the opening of the pavilion to the overlook, then back to Willuvian. "He may not express his gratitude," Ludmilla smiled slightly, "but it seems that he understands obligation. Trust will come with time. Make sure Willuvian knows not to do anything rash." "Yes, my lady." Willuvian's voice was sullen, but it had lost most of its previous edge. The elf chambermaid curtsied to the ladies at the table, then left the pavilion to return to her work. "Do you really take no issue with using children like this?" Florine asked. She washed down her lunch with a glass of chilled cuts juice. A maid came forward to refill the empty cup with more of the tart drink. "Like what?" Ludmilla asked without looking up from her notes. "It just seems bad for children to be cooperating in this sort of thing," Florine said. "They should be with their families, or doing something safe, not helping to dig up dirt on their hometown." "You heard the other girls from earlier this morning," Leanne said. "All of them are orphans. Being here is safer than some alley where they can simply be stolen away." "The shadow demons are doing most of the legwork," Ludmilla said. "I have no intention of making the children or any of our household servants go into town to do anything dangerous. They're just helping fill the blanks in our knowledge with what they know." "It still feels twisted," Florine said. "Everything about this fief is twisted. These kids don't even question what it is we are asking of them, they already know, and they don't give a whit either way." There was no argument there. Beyond their immediate reactions to being in the domain of House Facet, the morning's work have quite easily discovered a myriad of illicit dealings, and that the townsfolk were willingly complicit in such activities. When they arrived, Ludmilla had some hope that it would be a straightforward problem she could somehow deal with, but that had turned out to be wishful thinking. She set down the notes and expelled a frustrated breath. Unlike a song or story where the good and the evil were clearly defined to be reviled by an audience, there were no dark figures to expose pulling the strings from the shadows, nor were there any long stretches of history where the territory's population was unwillingly pressed into their actions. All that could be said was that House Facet was remiss of its duties and had allowed its domain to fall into the long and steady spiral of decline, creating dependencies that revolved around short-term gains and opening doors which should have never been touched in the first place. Generations of exposure to House Facet's administration and its results had affected the behavior of the people as well. Ideas of law and order and the perception of the world around them had adapted to allow the population to survive their reality. It was their normal, and Ludmilla suspected that even if she came upon a footpad standing over their latest victim, their response would not be one of guilt or shame. It was more likely that the criminal would simply ask her what the fine was so they could get on with their lives. As people were a product of their experiences and environment, so too had an entire culture grown in Facet County to match. The solution was beyond removing the leadership, or dealing with a handful of undesirable elements. There was no good or evil in such simplistic definition, there was only the reality that rose as a consequence of all that had happened. The people themselves had become the undesirable element within the greater context of the Sorceress Kingdom, and she could see no easy way to turn them from the mire they had been steeped in for their entire lives. No quick and convenient magic or medicine existed that could heal multiple generations buried in social decay. In the shade of the pavilion, the atmosphere grew darker with each passing hour as the sun shone blithely overhead. Willuvian would occasionally appear to add to their pile of findings and see if there was anything specific they wanted to look into, but, for the most part, the four noble women worked on in silence, compiling reports on the tasks they had divided between themselves. With twilight approaching, one of Lian's maids appeared. "My ladies," she said after paying her respects, "dinner is being laid out presently." "We'll come out later," Clara answered absently as she continued to work. "The rest of you may go ahead." Despite her focus, it took all of 5 minutes to tempt them out with the aroma of hot food and the idea of refreshment after the long afternoon of dismal toil. Seated outside of the pavilion around the table again, Florine broke the silence as they recovered in the cool evening breeze. "Is it just me?" she asked as she stared absently at the town, "or does this place just seem to get even worse the more we sift through everything?" Lian only answered with a languid groan as she slouched over the back of her chair. She seemed so fed up that she didn't even care about her slovenly posture in plain view. "There must be some way to salvage this," Clara was adamant. "The first barony is actually perfectly fine." "Yes, and the next 4 are absolutely terrible," Lian grumbled. "I can only imagine how bad the former Volkenheim barony is, given that rat Campbell made his nest there." "I would like to see this baroness in the northeast," Ludmilla said. She could have tipped the scales of this dispute either way, but she chose to remain neutral. Perhaps she might have a solution, her family having survived being under the facets for so long. "I think their solution was simply keeping to themselves," Lian countered. "Aside from meeting their explicit obligations, all of their practical ties are linked to Croston to the south, which isn't part of Facet County. The barony itself is a relatively quiet and remote part of the duchy. Even the great forest of Tob nearby doesn't give them any problems for whatever reason." "We're lucky that I drew the file for that barony," Clara smirked. If Ludmilla had ended up with it, she would have stared at it for hours trying to puzzle that particular detail out. "We're all like that when it comes to aspects to our respective fiefs, but this one is probably particularly frustrating for her." That was another reason why Ludmilla had wanted to visit. It, too, was a frontier territory, but the records they had recovered indicated that no apparent efforts or expenditures had been made to defend against the primal forest to the north. She was curious how they could have managed such a thing. No, rather than being a curiosity, it was such an anomaly that she had to make an active effort to not think about how they had gotten away with it. "I'll find out one of these days," Ludmilla said. "For the time being, I don't think we need to delay our initial preparations for dealing with the situation here, given what we've sifted through already."